Welcome to Future Economies Start with Youth, the podcast. My name is Kevin Palm. In today's episode, we will explore the opportunities and also the limitations of green policies in the business field. We know that business support is absolutely essential through achieving a net zero future. But how can we effectively translate environmental policies into our business settings? To help me answer and understand this question, I have three incredible experts today who will offer key insights into the theory and also the practicality of green policy implementation from an international business perspective. With me today are Rhys Morris. He's the managing partner of EMEA in Palladium and also the project director of the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment. And he's been managing partner in the EMEA business for 6 years now, working on employability and also business. Also, I have Sarah Uy, a UN youth representative on sustainable development, who is currently researching the Paris Climate Accord, specifically focusing on Sector 2.1C. And last but not least, joining from Uganda, I have Daniel Kayemba, the operations officer for EcoBricks, recycling organization, working on making his community a safer place. Thank you all for joining me today. I think we can all agree that the term green policies is quite a broad term for the organizational structures and regulations that are undertaken by relevant authorities to meet standards set on an international, national, and also a global level. It may be helpful to start with one of the broadest international standards, the Paris Climate Accord, and translate its relevance to the business domain. Sarah, I understand that you're actually writing your thesis on Article 2.1C of this agreement, and could you provide us a bit more overview of the targets in place regarding, these business commitments?
Yes, of course. So I think under the Paris Agreement, there are many possibilities to combat climate change. And Paris Agreement actually sets the scope for the international community to do so. And as you said, I'm currently doing my thesis on Article 2.1C, which is actually an interesting article because it actually lines out the climate finance. The Paris Agreement is super large, so I'm actually sometimes wondering which article is what again. But the Article 2.1C is about climate finance, and many targets for businesses and opportunities for businesses are possible under this article. So there's not a clear answer to what actually or what target actually falls under Article 2.1C because there's a lot possible. But it's interesting to look at it because it creates space. And I think this space is very important for businesses to step into because finance is still a common problem within climate change. And I think what Article 2.1C actually shows us is that there is a lot possible, but we still don't do enough. And finance is a problem, so it also sets the scope to find solutions together. And especially developing countries need more help in this. So what you see in the international community now is developing countries need to act or need to combat climate change too, but they just don't have the resources to do so or don't have enough resources. So Article 2.1C sets important targets for businesses, but it also can help create space for developing countries to have more space or free up fiscal resources to really make an effort to combat climate change too. So in my thesis, I'm not necessarily focusing on opening up more funds. So that's basically what people think about if you talk about climate change or climate finance in particular. Like we need to open more and more funds, and of course that is needed too. But what I'm looking at is looking at debt relief. So how can debt relief really play a role in climate finance too? Instead of giving more money, maybe we can look how debt relief can play a role and open up and free up more fiscal resources for developing countries to invest in more green initiatives. And also, of course, that open up space for private financial flows too if governments don't have that many debts anymore. So Article 2.1C is also about bringing the public and private financial flows in line with a low carbon economy. So if we look at debt relief and how that actually plays a role in this debate, we can try to make public and private financial flows in this goal. So as you see, there is a lot possible under Article 2.1c. And that is also important to remember, that it's not a clear-cut answer. But this is kind of my approach. And yeah.
Okay, wow. I really like you said it's not a clear-cut answer, because it's truly not a clear-cut answer. And in terms of the debt relief, I see that from my own perspective, from my country I come from. You see that a lot of the countries that try to give us funding, the funding is not for free. You have to inevitably pay it back, but then you're just postponing the debt that you inevitably have to pay. And that, for a small country or a developing country, is just impossible to maintain a sustainable government finance. So I'm really happy that you said that, and I think it's quite an important discussion we are supposed to be having, instead of just making finances available. So thank you so much, Sarah. And we also have the benefit of Daniel and Rhys's experience in engaging in diverse contexts, for example. And so, Daniel, I want to move on to you now. How have you experienced these green policy frameworks in carrying out your business operations and also in reaching those standards? Is there enough of a base for you to feel supported as a small and local enterprise?
Uh, Thank you so much. I'm Daniel Kayemba from Uganda, where I work with EcoBricks. And EcoBricks is a plastic cycling industry in Masaka, which is 105 kilometers south of Uganda, or south of the capital. So, growing up in Uganda, we've had very many green policies even before the Paris Agreement. We've had the NEMA Act, the NEMA policies, National Environmental Management Acts of 1995, which talk about how best we can start up green businesses and guide on the best way of having them. However, we've had very many conversations. Uganda is subjected to very many accords like the Paris Agreement, like the UNFCCC, the Tokyo, the Taichi Targets, Bonn Challenge. All of them have been there, and in a good sense, they are really nice and good, but they have not been reflected into the business world. So, for example, when we are doing our plastic recycling, not very many policies can reflect into our work, because we are still we don't see the incentives which would be there to help us to run our businesses. Because some of these policies are encouraging the government to finance projects like mine, because since I'm doing the good work of cleaning up the environment, taking the plastics around the people's communities, I'm expected at least to get some tax benefits, but well, they are not there. So at some point, we have policies on the paper, but the implementation is not really reflecting on the ground, and we really get out of kickbacks onto our businesses, which lead into less productivity within the team and within the work we are doing. If I may answer you like that, yeah.
Okay. I would love to touch back on something you say, because it's truly an incredible thing we have to discuss. But in terms of what you said, from this understanding, a high level event like, for example, the COP27, it was aimed to create this dialogue for win-win solutions that hold both businesses and also institutions to account, by ensuring this transparency and accountability with, for example, non-state actors. So, Sarah, I understand you were actually a member of the Dutch delegation to COP27. What were the realities underground of the negotiations like?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so as youth representatives, we are part or official part of the Dutch delegation towards these UNFCCC. So UNFCCC stands for United Nations Framework on the Convention of Climate Change, and this is a framework where the Dutch delegation goes to as well to negotiate the climate outcomes. And I cannot really tell much about the negotiations itself, because it is also something that happens sometimes behind doors. But what I can tell is that the negotiations and side events are two different parts of the whole conference. So you have negotiations where mostly policymakers go to, and delegations. You also have side events where policymakers go to, and where actually the public or like NGOs and other members can organize events to raise awareness about certain topics. And these side events are very important to have an influence at the negotiations or in the negotiations. So the side events are very important to raise certain awarenesses. And we got invited to one of the side events where a lot of businesses attended. And what you actually see is that they are struggling within this current economic structure. So there are companies that are willing to have more sustainable policies in place, but they are afraid of when they do so that they will be pushed out of the market because they just are not, if the rest doesn't change, then they are not that profitable as others. So they are very afraid that they will be pushed out of the market and then some other company will take their place, and then you don't solve any problem because you still have this, toxic economic structure in place, which apparently pushes companies to strive for short-term gains instead of long-term sustainable goals. Um, so in the end, they really want to, but they don't. And I think what these kinds of events show us is that we really should strive for more long-term thinking, and we need to push that within negotiations as well, of course. So we as youth representatives really try to shed light on youth and their inputs, and of course also future generations and how those people should be represented in policies, and that inquires long-term thinking. So we really try to push that within policymaking, but also with regard to these businesses that we have met. So I think that's very important to take into account.
Yeah, I really like that you mentioned, this long-term thinking, because who is better than thinking in the long term than young people? So I'm really happy that people like you, young people, these young leaders, are at those conferences because we are the future, but we're also the present, and we have to be in these things and in these conferences to change the world. Because if we leave it up to the old generation, unfortunately, I don't think we're gonna get much further than that. But I want to move now to you, Rhys, as someone who has insight into both the inner workings of a large corporate entity and also strong ties with the SMEs that have been supported by this entity. Do you believe that as a larger entity, enacting substantial change, the type of change that does not just greenwash but goes further and operates within the traditional economic model, do you think that enacting substantial change is inherently a market risk?
I actually have a pretty strong view that not enacting the change is a greater market risk. I think if you look, I have a huge amount of sympathy actually with Sarah's point there around the perverse incentives in changing and changing operating models. But the reality is that when you look at the framework within which we, for example, contract, which is broadly speaking public funding, we are seeing more and more or heavier and heavier requirements around making sure we're doing the right thing in this area, making sure that we stand up to our commitments, and those commitments are pretty clear around carbon neutrality by 2030 and making sure we're behaving in that way. So I think, there is that external pressure, making sure that we are kept honest, and that does flow through the supply chain as well, and make sure that organizations like us have to be looking all the way through our partners. We also have a really hard and arguably stronger internal push. Palladium wants to recruit the best people in the market. I think I'm not sure which side of the fence in terms of old and young I sit, but we're certainly keen on attracting the best young talent to come and deliver our work. And I think people like me are held to real account by our staff around, are you actually committing to delivering what you say you are? Are you standing up to the best possible standards? Are you committing to ensuring the Palladium is on the right side of the argument as far as this is concerned and delivering in that way? So from my perspective, market failure is actually much closer from not making these changes and not moving forward.
Yeah, that's quite interesting to hear, I must say. But would you also say that for example, smaller projects, there's more freedom to implement a robust green initiative, or you're more constrained by these donor requirements?
I think, it's a great question. The problem we see is where legislation or rules or requirements change mid-program, as opposed to understanding that something is coming in and perhaps having a longer lead into it, I suppose, would be the way I would describe it. We have programs that operate typically over 5 or 6 years. If we start a program from a position of being implementing change and driving a true green agenda in terms of the program, it's pretty straightforward to do. You're starting from that position. But for some of our longer programs operating, let's say year 4 out of a 5-year program, it can be very hard to make that change. Ultimately, the euro value of the change might be very different. The level of effort is relative based on the size of the entity making the change. So there isn't really an excuse there. It's just, and I tend to see actually patience in terms of having time to change, make adjustments. And so I don't really see an issue as far as that's concerned. I mean, the point, I suppose, more broadly is making sure that we're starting on the right foot and heading off in that direction.
Exactly. That's quite interesting to hear, and I want to hear now from a local perspective on the same question. Daniel, I want to move on to you now. Do you agree with what Rhys said? Did you experience hesitancy from donors because of your ambitious goals as a small local company?
Thank you, Kevin. But also to go back on Sarah's point and Rhys's point, I think I concur with them on how we are really moving on. So sometimes when you see a project like EcoBricks, yeah, it works so hard to see that it's really sustainable. But at some point, we are restricted by the donors once vis-a-vis our organization goals. For example, at some point, our dream is to recycle as much plastics as we can from the environment or collect it. But a donor comes in and cannot invest in the machines or the labor, but they invest in advocacy. So we just have to increase more and more trainings instead of collecting more and more plastics. So at some point there, we wouldn't see that we are bringing up our real goal, which really affects us. So what EcoBricks does, we have created different departments talk about the different ways of advocacy, then market, how can we hit the market. So here we talk about the local market and the national market. For the local market, we have different making. We make tables out of the plastics, benches, we make troughs for animals out of plastics and all other products. So, but then we are competing with the investors who are coming to the economy and using resin or raw material for making plastic materials or other materials. And for us, we are using the recycled one. And I'm telling you, Kevin, using the recycled material is much more expensive than using the resin or the fresh raw materials for making plastics. So at some point, the government cannot regulate, if at all it would have regulated and said maybe we cannot allowing resin for the materials which can be made from waste plastic internally. That would be a good one. But right now we are competing with investors from the east, from the Asia and Middle East who are coming in with a lot of money, and then they are disrupting the whole economic system and our marketing strategies. So at some point we are really strained on the way we are moving on, which is really hard for us to move on in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this also ties into Sarah's earlier points because you mentioned, Sarah, that long-term thinking, and unfortunately being sustainable is not the cheapest option in most sectors, and I think we do have to think long-term. But Sarah, you wanted to mention something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that point. Like, I completely agree with what has been said already. But I also want to add that we have international, national, and local markets, but we also have different markets. So vertically, we also have not only plastic markets, but we also have fossil fuel markets. And the current situation right now is that, for example, big countries like China and India don't feel like committing themselves to climate goals that much as other parts of the world, because they have the feeling that they still need to make some sort of development growth before they can actually say, okay, we have enough capacity to really contribute to our extent. And that makes sure, or that leads actually to the fact that there's still a very high demand for fossil fuels. So fossil fuels companies know that they can make a lot of money still out of it, and a lot of governments are still subsidizing this market in order to make more money. And I think that, like, of course, there are markets where not doing anything is a market risk in itself. So I think that's a very good change or a very good shift, that not doing anything leads to actually more market risk than continuing the way we are now having our economy. But for some markets, it does count, though, that there's still a lot of risk by acting sustainable, like, for example, within fossil fuels. And I think that should really change, because if we really want to commit ourselves to climate goals, then we need to, as a government or as the public, we need to intervene. And I think that's not happening much. And well, as has been said, like, I think it's very good that not doing anything creates a risk, but in some cases, it's still profitable for companies to not do anything, and I think that should change.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to reach long-term sustainability, we can't just rely on these small changes. We have to do big things, big steps, and that's
Yeah,
what the world is struggling with. So I agree with you.
yeah, and I think also that governments should really make a distinction between markets where it actually goes well. So as has been said, like, some markets already act upon sustainability goals themselves, and that's very good. So some markets we don't have to intervene, but we have to acknowledge that there are some markets where intervention is needed by governments and policymakers, and to really restrict certain market areas. So I think we should be true with ourselves and also think about market interventions. Although we are not really much a fan of that in Europe, but I think we should think about it.
And Daniel, you wanted to say something too?
Yeah, I think I wanted to add on to Sarah's point. For example, sometimes we get very many big corporations coming from Europe and buying our carbon credits here in Masaka or in Uganda. And then sometimes our government are not experts enough to convert our energy or our waste into carbon credits so that we can use it on our NDCs we commit to. Then you find that some corporations which are highly polluting all their fossil fuel miners from Europe come here, buy off the carbon they buy the carbon credits, then they go back and use it in their reports and be like they are the one who are contributing to it. So I believe that if our local government in LDCs understand how much they can rely on our data and our carbon removed from the environment, I think it can also change on the policies or green policies they are giving to us, or they can add on to they can incentivize on some of the things we do or we use in our daily lives and for sustainability. Yeah.
Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads here, so I think we can all agree on that. You want to add something too, Rhys?
I completely agree. And there's been a huge amount of media exposure over the last couple of weeks or months around how effective carbon credits actually are as tools for defraying the impact of carbon, defraying the impact of large polluters. I think, from a personal perspective, and you see large numbers of organizations starting to move away from it. So, airlines, for example, have now turned around and said, well, we're not going to invest in carbon credits, we're actually going to invest in cleaner technology. And I think, it's the market does seem to be shifting and moving towards science-based targets as opposed to measures such as carbon credits, which are by their very nature really quite hard to quantify and really quite hard to monitor, particularly over a extended period of time. So I completely agree. I think it's it's not it's difficult to describe as a flawed mechanism because change, at least change moving in a trajectory, is good. But I think it's acknowledging that carbon credits in particular don't provide the whole solution to where we're going.
Exactly. I think we can all agree that change is needed, but we can also agree when change is not sufficient, and we can, develop better systems to, bring this change. So I really like that you mentioned that. And Sarah and Rhys, you both have experience working in larger corporations, also in international settings. What are the key challenges in creating a unified green policy on intergovernment level, and also in a business setting? So Sarah, what do you think about this?
Yeah, for the business setting, I'm not really sure because I'm only observing it from the side. But with regard to the international political community, of course, the most difficult thing I guess is the consensus. So within a lot of negotiations, the consensus is needed to reach to certain outcomes, and not all of them, of course. We have different ways to agree to certain things. But if you really want to have an international commitment, then you really want that every country is on the same line and that every country commits as much as you do as a country. So I think that's the most difficult part, that you're not really sure what other countries are actually willing to do. And of course, we have these negotiations, which we observe too. But it's still hard to measure, like, what is the international consensus, and is every single country willing to contribute enough? So I think that's the most difficult thing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna repeat the question again to you, Reese. What are the key challenges in creating a unified green policy on an intergovernment level and also in a business setting?
So I'll take the business setting, and I think we in Palladium have adopted an approach that says that we're not going to follow the political environment. At least, the danger with following a purely political decision-making process or pressure is that pressure becomes variable. Changes in government mean changes in how much a government is willing to focus on the issue. And so we tend to try and adopt the high watermark. We've done the same in terms of our policies around safety and more broadly around financial management. But we will, as far as this is concerned, we look at what's the high watermark, and in this case, it's science-based targets, and how do we as an organization shift ourselves to ensure that we're behaving in the most positive way as far as that's concerned. We use we have an in-house nature-based solutions team and a climate team that advise us, and we're fortunate in that, right? I think when you look at how we respond to client or how we respond to government, it's quite interesting to watch. Government's attempt or clients giving us, it's most helpful when those clients give us broad frameworks within which to achieve an aim. So if you look at the recent development cooperation framework from the Dutch government, for example, which actually prioritizes investment in green technology and in green projects and in green jobs, and provides a framework to operate within, but allows local nuance, allows us to understand the local market conditions and still deliver. I think that's the most effective way for allowing that to work. And from our perspective, we'll always strive to be the best and strive to do this in the best possible way. But operating within a framework issued from client in that way is also very, very helpful.
Okay, and have you also noticed a change in commitment regarding these green initiatives going beyond just surface level greenwashing, with a greater desire for carbon verification and also for carbon neutrality standards?
So I think greenwashing won't wash. Simple. I think you've had Deutsche Bank recently receiving a raid for making claims around their greenwashing initiatives that simply didn't stack up. I think the pace of public opinion, the pace of organizational change, the pace of private sector understanding of what actually works and what is hogwash, committing to standards that allow you to still be naughty, but actually not really change as an organization, it doesn't stack up. And I think I am seeing a real change. I'm seeing a real movement. And actually, if governments are going to commit and truly commit, if they are going to start targeting big name organizations who are effectively committing fraud in what they're saying they're doing, then you might actually start seeing that tipping point that we're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. I love that you mentioned, greenwashing doesn't wash, because that's true. And I think that's really one of the greatest quotes I've heard in this episode. But Daniel, I want to ask you too now. Have you noticed a change in commitment regarding green initiatives going beyond surface level greenwashing?
Kevin, thank you. But also, maybe to touch little on Rhys's commitment or comment on the about the greenwashing. Recently, last week, I was invited on by one of the biggest polluters. They have a group of their polluters, the plastic producers, and they wanted to work with us to start paying us money for collecting up their plastic, which ends up in Lake Victoria, then also which ends up in the Nile. So when I was in the conference, and I raised my hand up and I told them, before you tell us to start working with you to remove all that plastic, tell us how much you produce so that we know the numbers upon which we are working on. They couldn't give me the numbers and details, so that they were telling more, it's more confidential and all that. Then the next thing they were telling me that, we're going to work with you and so that you can start recycling. I was like, okay, if you are to start recycling bottles for you to use, or first start supplying you with resin, do you give us a commitment you will stop importing in fresh waste materials for making the bottles so that you can feed on our market? They couldn't commit to that. So greenwashing is a reality, even more back here, this side. So going back to your question on how we are trying to do this in terms of how EcoBricks can work together and see that we have a win-win. I think number one, our work is being collected for the last 3 years. We've collected close to 587 tons of waste plastic from the environment. That enough can influence any government to give us a tax holiday or work with us to see that we keep cleaning up the mess which is being into the environment, which is being poured into the environment. And two, the government can also try to give us innovation lines, because they have the capacity to give us innovation lines, link us with other global machineries and inventors whom can help us come up with different ideas and do a lot of things together. So as long as they can give us tax incentives, work into our innovation lines, and also give us clean energy, perhaps like solar plants, which can help us run all the machines and everything, and even other incentives which can be given to other green enterprises around. I think that can be a good way to see it. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear. And I want to move now to you, Rhys. Do you believe that real change comes from, pressures within, internally from your organization, or also externally from key stakeholders? How do you see this?
Unequivocally, both. I think, I've talked about our staff. It's quite interesting. We were approached by a client fairly recently and asked to consider working with them. And I think it's probably within about 24 hours, and it would have probably been within days. And honestly, I was approached and asked about the details on the project, or what the potential project was. Or was it not greenwashing? People are generally interested and very driven by this. And so you have that internal pressure, really, as far as we're concerned, to do better and to be the best. Talked about client, and I think from our perspective, the market, certainly the markets in Europe and the UK, are changing. Clients that would have traditionally have been pretty agnostic and disinterested are now very interested in holding to a standard. So, the organizations that turn around and say, we commit to science-based targets, we commit to real change, do have a market position, do have a market advantage, perhaps embryonic, but certainly growing. And I think when you look at EcoBricks' situation and Daniel's situation as far as Uganda is concerned, my hope is that by that pressure appearing for organizations like us, and us taking the view, which we do, that we have to help the supply chain and colleagues to achieve a standard, then you'll start seeing that change driven through the business organization and the broader ecosystem.
Okay. And is this something we all recognize? So Sarah, do you believe that real change comes from pressure externally from key stakeholders, or internally from within organizations?
I think I agree with the point that has been made by Rhys. because I think it comes from both internally and also both externally. So I think what we have to remember is, and that also touch upon the discussion of greenwashing, is that humans have caused this problem of climate change and the loss of biodiversity, and etc. So humans are also the actors that can solve it or can at least limit the damages that climate change brings. So if we're talking about humans, they can actually pressure change. And whether that's externally or internally, it doesn't really matter. Because I think we have come to a phase where humans really have to ask themselves, like like philosophical questions, like who are we as humans? Are we going to keep going like this, or are we actually going to change it? And I think this movement has started already, and I think that's very good. And whether that's externally or internally, that's fine. Like, I think both is very much needed, as has been said before. So I'm also very glad that, for example, there was this piece in the newspapers a few weeks ago where the activism within ministries and government bodies were analyzed. So I think it's needed, like both internally and externally.
Okay, and Daniel, from your local's perspective, how do you see this?
uh, because the world is changing. Yeah, if you go back in around 10 years, you couldn't know about we didn't know about the Paris Agreement, the SDGs. They're all not in our conversation. But right now the world is changing, and we're trying to change with it changing together because we're in a global village. However, when you go back to where I am, Masaka, there are very many words which are not even there in our local dialect. Like, for example, green policy. If you ask me what is a green policy, how do you call that in my local language, in Uganda? I can't tell you because it's not there. I have to use more than 10 sentences to mean one word. You talk about climate change. People know climate is changing, but people, they cannot, you know that at least the days are changing. For example, in January, people used to tell me how many days it will rain. So, for example, they told me that it was going to rain for around 18 days, but it rained for 16 days, and they were like, almost. But then things are changing. Nowadays, it's not perfect so much. But for me, on the back of my mind, I know that at least it is the climate changing. So I have to sit down, tell them how their way of living affects the environment. Then you have to go back and define what environment means. Then you go back and talk about the Paris Agreement. What does it mean, if at all even they know what Paris means? So there is a big difference between the conversation we usually have on Zoom, in conferences, on international organization, and also the serious session of world conversation back to reality. If you talk about greenwashing, what does greenwashing mean to a farmer who wakes up every day to go and grow coffee? So as EcoBricks, we try to have this conversation in our local language, teaching people what it means. And if you teach someone what it means, he goes back and tells their friends and their families, and you see that at least their lives are changing. But in all, there's a big difference between the elites who know about climate, environmentalism, and all that, climate change, to the real translation and dialect into our local language. Yeah, I'll tell you like that.
Yeah, it seems like your organization has been doing amazing work. Thank you so much for it. And I'm gonna move now to you, Rhys. From an operational perspective, what do you find is the greatest challenge once you have won a bid, but the client's projections are not really aligned with your business sustainability goals? How do you do this?
I think it's what we talked about earlier. It's that change in direction. If we have to adjust the way we're operating mid-operation, for want of a better term, there's necessarily an efficiency loss. It can be difficult, but it's the right. I think we could say it's difficult all day long, and I think that would apply to the whole problem in many ways. I think, but we take the approach that if the policy changes, or if the science behind what we're seeing changes and requires a change from us, then we will flex and we'll do so. I think our role is more around trying to help our supply chain to do so as well. But that's certainly where, if I was to take our PropCon project, for example, that it operates in Nigeria, has to have 7 or 8 vehicles. They're all petrol vehicles, they're all SUVs. And using a very straightforward example, I can't tomorrow remove those SUVs and put in electric or hybrid vehicles to replace them. It's that move and change as things happen during projects. I think we probably find the hardest.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear. And I want to move back to you, Daniel. I want to move to some of the things you said earlier in this episode. Based on the understanding that Rhys just provided us, Daniel, where the government hasn't supplied you with enough policy support in the past, do you have an example on how to propose win-win solutions for governments to implement policies that benefit those acting sustainably, just like EcoBricks?
Okay, I'll build it on Rhys's submission where he says that I would say that sometimes the substitution for the environmental endangering options are more expensive than what we've been using. For example, if someone is to buy a solar panel to change it for what he was using or for fossil fuel, it will be more expensive than the fossil fuel itself. So I think the government can invest more in clean energy. How is just by giving tax incentives to organizations like us who are doing a lot of work in environmental and other stuff like that. Also, the government should come down and understand the kind of work we are doing. Yeah, I told you earlier on that we work close to 587 tons of waste plastic from the environment. That is from Lake Victoria. We've had more than 40% of that tonnage from only Lake Victoria shores, which is floating within. So what we are doing right now in Masaka, it's supposed to be the government's work. So we're trying to clean it up. You should give us tax holidays, but then tax the polluters, give us tax incentives, tax polluters, and remove substitutes from the market to allow us expand and sustainably grow. I think that can really make a lot of sense in that regard. This can not only be for me, but also it should increase on a lot of taxes on the waste producers or the fossil fuel people who are really bringing a lot of fossil fuel into the economy and also polluting the environment. So if that is done, I think it can make a lot of sense. And also, the government should look at how best they can work with us in terms of innovation. Perhaps we can make bridges out of the waste we are doing. So it should come back and come to us. Recently, we had got a project of fencing one of the national parks using our recycled materials. A national park which is bigger than 4,000 square kilometers. But before you know it, the tender was taken off because there was another investor from Asia who was having cheaper and also easier to find raw material, which was from which he was shipping in waste of materials. So you see that Daniel is competing with an investor who has a lot of money, a lot of money just to come and splash around. Yet for me, I'm struggling to get the plastic, wash it. I work with more than 200 people who are supposed to come and see that they have the best plastic, then sort it, then you use it, then use the electricity which is being charged highly, then you use a lot of manpower, then with hard and really hard to find innovations. So if the government can see what we are doing, compare it with other external, and then support whatever we are doing, I think that can make a win-win situation. Give us the tax incentives, we make a threefold or a tenfold of the market, and also give the best out of whatever trash we are collecting out there. Yeah.
That's really good to hear, and I want to move now to the to round up the discussion by returning back to the opening of the episode. Actually, so Sarah and Rhys, I want to focus on you now. How do we address the gap between the business targets established by the Paris Climate Accord and the immediate actions we can all take on an operational level? Sarah.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I'm not sure if I can cover everything in one answer. But I want to refer back to something I have said earlier, and it's about humans. Like we are humans, and changing things and setting in motions to make an effort to combat climate change or to impose sustainable goals I think it's human work. And what we have to realize is that mistakes happen, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to evaluate the past and say, like, hey, we have messed up and we're going to do something about it. So I think the most important gap is that we have to acknowledge that we have made mistakes, and that it takes human efforts to change it and to make it good. And now, currently, what sometimes is missing is real action and really committing to the Paris Agreement. And that we should really ask ourselves that philosophical question, like, what are we doing as humans, and how, and what are we actually, and what do we want to be? Because if we do that and we start believing in solutions and that human can actually solve this crisis, I think we can actually commit ourselves to it, and we can also bridge the gap between commitment and business opportunities, because companies are also run by people and actual humans. So I'm very glad to see Daniel and Rhys, actual people changing things in their own companies and their own projects. So I think that's very hopeful. But we have to acknowledge that in other situations and in other companies too. If we get to change the humans within Shell, for example, we can change the world. So I think we should really start with ourselves, and I think that's the solution to bridge that gap.
Exactly. Let's try to change the world. So Reese, how do you think we can bridge the gap between business targets and actions we can take?
Well, I think Sarah's just put her finger on it. We look at Palladium as an organization, but that organization is somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people, depending on how many consultants. You change the behavior of this organization, you have an impact. We talk about positive impact. What could be more positive an impact than that? Absolutely powerful. And I think it is about cross-organizational behavioral change.
Yeah, this conversation is really giving me hope for the future, I must say. But long-term thinking, asking ourselves who we are, admitting that greenwashing isn't washing. I think it's clear that to enact real behavioral change, the positive impact of green policies in a business setting requires a symbiotic demand for change both internally and also externally. We, as a collective, can be proactive about the desire to meet these targets, and international standards and policies in place can be both a source of support and also a tool for accountability. This was Future Economies Start with Youth, the podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.